play it, and my bonus is yours. The voice was slick with arrogance, a sound that slid across the vast marble floor of the lobby like oil on glass. Marcus Thorne didn't look up from his work, his calloused hand continuing its steady, circular motion as he buffed a stubborn scuff mark near the base of a chrome pillar. The reflection that stared back was that of a man in a simple gray janitor's uniform, worn at the collar and cuffs but immaculately clean. His face was tired, etched with lines that spoke of too many long nights and not enough easy mornings, but his eyes held a deep, quiet stillness. Behind him, near the imposing security desk, his daughter sat at a small, forgotten coffee table. Maya, all of 6 years old, was a small island of concentration in the sterile ocean of the corporate headquarters. Her head was bent over a piece of paper, a fistful of crayons clutched in her hand, her presence a quiet anomaly in this cathedral of commerce. The babysitter had cancelled with a fever, and the world did not stop for a single father with a floor to polish. Marcus's world was small, and its center was this little girl, drawing worlds of her own with wax and paper. A shift in the lobby's atmosphere, sharp and sudden as a drop in barometric pressure, made the hairs on Marcus's arms stand up. He glanced toward the grand, floating staircase of glass and steel. Eleanor Vance was descending. She moved not like a person walking, but like a force of nature sweeping through its domain. Her suit was a sharp, unforgiving black, her heels clicking against the glass steps with the cold finality of a judge's gavel. She was the architect of this kingdom, the self-made CEO of Vance Innovations, and her face was a mask of glacial disappointment. She didn't look at Marcus. He was part of the building's machinery, as inanimate as the gleaming elevators and silent security cameras. Her focus was locked on a man in a tailored suit who was practically wilting under her gaze. The Axiom launch is not experiencing minor setbacks, Robert. Eleanor's voice was low, but it cut through the cavernous space, each word a perfectly formed shard of ice. It is a categorical failure. Your projections were not optimistic. They were delusional. Fix it. Or I will find someone who can. Robert, the executive, fumbled with a thick, leather-bound binder, his hands trembling. Yes, Miss Vance. Of course. I have the revised, it's right here. In his haste, the heavy binder slipped from his grasp. It hit the marble floor with a concussive crack that echoed like a gunshot. The sound shattered the quiet bubble around Maya. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Her small face crumpled, a prelude to the storm that followed. A single, high-pitched sob escaped her lips, then another, a torrent of sudden, overwhelming fear and sensory overload. The world narrowed for Marcus. The CEO, the executive, the gleaming lobby, it all faded into a blurry periphery. There was only the sound of his daughter's distress. He dropped his polishing cloth and was at her side in 3 long, silent strides. He didn't speak. Words were clumsy, useless things in moments like this. He knelt before her, his large frame a gentle shield against the cold, intimidating space. He took her small, trembling hands in his own. He met her tear-filled eyes, his gaze steady and unwavering. Then he began to tap. On the cold marble floor, his fingers created a silent song. It started simply, a gentle, predictable rhythm, 1 2 3, 1 2 3. Then, it grew more complex. His left hand laid down a steady, grounding beat while his right hand danced around it, weaving a syncopated, intricate melody of taps and slides. It was a language only the two of them knew, a lullaby played on a keyboard of stone. He leaned in, and a low, resonant hum vibrated from his chest, a single, perfect note that seemed to absorb her sobs, calming the frantic energy in the air. Maya's crying hiccuped, then slowed, her breathing beginning to match the steady rhythm of his left hand. She watched his fingers, mesmerized, the source of her fear forgotten, replaced by the familiar magic of her father's quiet grace. From the base of the staircase, Eleanor Vance stood frozen. She had witnessed the entire interaction. Her sharp words had been the catalyst, the dropped binder the trigger. She had created the chaos. And he, the janitor, had resolved it. He hadn't shushed or scolded or panicked. He had responded to an emotional crisis with an act of profound, intuitive artistry. It was like watching a master craftsman repair a delicate instrument with nothing but his bare hands. She wasn't impressed, the word was too shallow. She was fundamentally shaken. The quiet competence, the nonverbal empathy, it was a form of strength she had never encountered, a power that had nothing to do with market share or corporate dominance. She watched as he gently wiped the last tear from Maya's cheek with his thumb. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, and she returned it, the storm having passed as quickly as it had arrived. For a moment, the two of them existed in a world of their own, a fortress of love and understanding in the middle of her cold, sterile lobby. Her own world felt a little less solid. The mask of the unflinching CEO felt thin, brittle. Driven by a curiosity so intense it was a physical ache, she took a step forward, the click of her heel announcing her presence. Marcus looked up, his expression guarded. Eleanor stopped a few feet away, her corporate authority feeling like an ill-fitting costume in the face of what she had just seen. She looked from the father to the child, a question forming on her lips that had nothing to do with business. "I have a new initiative," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Employee wellness. I need an observer. A special consultant." Marcus's brow furrowed in confusion. He slowly rose to his feet, placing himself subtly between her and his daughter. "Ma'am, I'm the janitor. I'm aware of what your job title is," Eleanor replied, her gaze direct. She was testing him, though she didn't know for what. "This would be a different role. With a different salary." He looked at Maya, then back at Eleanor. He saw no trap, only a strange, earnest confusion in the powerful woman's eyes. But he wasn't looking for a handout. He wasn't looking for anything but to do his job and raise his daughter. "Thank you, ma'am. But we're fine." His hesitation wasn't a negotiating tactic. It was the honest reluctance of a man who had learned not to want more than he had. Eleanor was used to people who would do anything for the opportunities she offered. His refusal was more intriguing than his acceptance would have been. "It isn't a request," she stated, a hint of the old command in her tone, though it was tempered by this new, unsettling feeling. "Your new position starts tomorrow. My assistant will have the details." She needed to understand the anomaly he represented. She needed to know how he had created such peace with so little. The office they gave him was more of a closet with a window. It was on the 27th floor, tucked away behind a row of humming servers, a forgotten space for forgotten things. It contained a simple desk, a chair, and a layer of dust that suggested no one had entered it for years. Marcus cleaned it himself on his first day, the familiar motions of wiping down surfaces and clearing away neglect a comfort in this strange, new altitude. His title was Wellness Integration Consultant, a string of corporate nonsense that meant nothing and everything. His directive from Eleanor Vance, delivered via a crisp email from her assistant, was simply to observe and report. So he observed. He walked the hushed, carpeted hallways of Vance Innovations, a ghost in a new uniform, simple slacks and a button-down shirt that felt stiff and foreign. He wasn't looking at spreadsheets or market analyses. He was looking at people. He saw the way a young programmer on the 14th floor squinted at her monitor, her brow permanently furrowed. During his lunch break, he went to a hardware store and returned with a new, full-spectrum fluorescent bulb. When she stepped away for coffee, he quietly swapped it out. He watched from a distance as she returned, sat down, and after a moment, the tight knot between her eyes visibly relaxed. She didn't know why. She just felt better. He heard the incessant, high-pitched squeak of the mail cart as it made its rounds, a sound that frayed the nerves of everyone on the open-plan floor. The next morning, a small can of lubricating oil sat on the cart's handle with an anonymous note that read, "For your sanity." The cart rolled by in blissful silence for the rest of the day. He noticed the stark, sterile reception area on the executive floor, a space designed to impress but not to welcome. He spent $20 of his new, bewildering salary on a small, hardy snake plant in a simple terracotta pot and placed it on the corner of the marble desk. The splash of green was a quiet rebellion against the monochrome world of steel and glass. These were small acts, invisible repairs to the building's soul. He fixed things, both physical and emotional, that were so persistently broken, everyone else had simply stopped noticing. He moved through the corporate machine not as a cog, but as a quiet, steadying hand. He never spoke in meetings he was now required to attend, but his presence was a strange, calming force. Chadwick, the vice president of strategic growth, noticed Marcus's presence in a different way. Chadwick was a man sculpted from ambition and hair gel, a believer in the loud, performative school of success. He was the one who had made the joke about the piano, a casual cruelty he'd long since forgotten. He saw Marcus as Eleanor's bizarre pet project, an absurdity that undermined the natural corporate order. He'd corner Marcus by the coffee machine, a smug smile plastered on his face. "Figured out how to optimize our synergy yet, champ?" he'd ask, his voice dripping with condescension. Or, "How's the observing going? Don't work too hard." Marcus would simply meet his gaze with that unnerving stillness and offer a quiet, "Have a good day, Mr. Jennings." He refused to be baited. His integrity was a shield Chadwick's barbs couldn't pierce. From her glass-walled office, her tower within the tower, Eleanor watched it all. She read the one-sentence reports Marcus emailed her at the end of each day. The light on the 14th floor was causing eye strain. "It's fixed now," or, "The mail cart no longer squeaks." They were absurd. They were trivial. And yet, she cross-referenced them with productivity reports and internal complaint logs. Sick days on the 14th floor were down. A sentiment analysis of interoffice emails showed a marked decrease in irritable language. The changes were subtle, but they were real. He was healing her company in ways her expensive management consultants never could. She found herself watching him on the security monitors, tracing his slow, deliberate path through the building. She was watching a man who solved problems not by imposing his will, but by paying attention. The mystery of him only deepened, pulling her further from the safe, sterile shores of her own life. He was a quiet variable in her perfectly controlled equation, and his effect was becoming impossible to ignore. A storm broke over the city, a furious lash of wind and rain that turned the sky into a bruised purple canvas. The glass walls of the Vance Innovations Tower became a cascade of water, distorting the glittering skyline into a weeping, abstract painting. It was late, well past midnight, and Eleanor was still in her office. She couldn't go home. The silence of her sprawling penthouse apartment was often louder than the storm. Grief was a storm of its own, and tonight memories of her father, of his cold approval, his transactional affection, were raging within her. She worked because the hollow echo of her own success was the only thing that could drown out the silence. It was then she heard it. Faintly at first, a sound that seemed to rise from the very bones of the building. Music. A piano. It was impossible. There were no pianos on the executive floors. She rose from her desk, her bare feet silent on the cold marble, and followed the sound. It led her down a dimly lit corridor, away from the offices and boardrooms, toward the old executive founder's lounge, a relic from a previous era that was now used for storage. The music grew stronger, clearer, a torrent of sound that was achingly sad and yet profoundly beautiful. It was a melody steeped in loss, a complex and masterful composition that spoke of a love that endured past its own ending. She pushed the heavy oak door open a crack. And she saw him. In the center of the room, draped in a dusty canvas cover, sat a forgotten concert grand piano. Marcus was seated before it, the cover pulled back just enough to expose the keys. He thought he was alone in the skyscraper, alone with the storm inside and out. He was not performing, he was communing. His eyes were closed, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm, his fingers moving over the ivory keys with a fluid, intimate grace. This was not the work of a hobbyist. This was the soul of a virtuoso, unleashed. The music was a confession, a story told in chords and arpeggios. Eleanor heard the joy of a deep love, the sharp, sudden stab of tragedy, the long, quiet years of a grief carried with unwavering dignity. She heard the sacrifice. She heard the strength. She heard the sound of a man who had chosen his daughter over his art, and in doing so, had made his life a different kind of masterpiece. This was the source of the quiet rhythm that had soothed his crying child. This was the hidden genius behind the gentle hand that fixed flickering lights. This was the man, stripped of his uniform, his title, his place in her corporate world. He was an artist of profound depth and feeling. Eleanor stood in the shadows, her hand pressed against her mouth. The music bypassed every defense she had ever built, every wall she had ever constructed around her heart. It didn't knock them down, it simply flowed through them like water through sand. It found the lonely, unloved child within the powerful CO and spoke to her. Tears she hadn't shed since she was a girl burned in her eyes and traced hot paths down her cheeks. She was witnessing something sacred, a private act of remembrance and release. Before the final, heartbreakingly gentle note faded into the sound of the rain, she slipped away, her own armor cracked beyond repair. She now knew his secret. And the knowledge had changed everything. The next time Marcus had to bring Maya to the office, the babysitter network having failed him again, he expected a reprimand, a reminder of professional boundaries. Instead, Eleanor's assistant met them at the elevator with a warm smile and an invitation. Ms. Vance was hoping Maya might like to see her office. Marcus was hesitant, but Maya, holding a small folder of her latest drawings, was intrigued. She walked into Eleanor's panoramic corner office without a trace of intimidation. It was a vast, minimalist space, a testament to power and control. A single, massive desk of dark wood sat like an altar before a wall of glass that overlooked the entire city. The silence was heavy, curated. Maya took it all in, her small head tilting. She walked right up to the desk where Eleanor sat, looking impossibly poised in a sharp, cream-colored dress. Maya looked past the dress, past the desk, past the view. She looked right at the woman. "You have sad eyes," she said. The words were simple, a child's unfiltered observation. A truth bomb that detonated in the pristine silence of the room. Eleanor froze. For a decade, people had only seen the CEO. They saw the power, the success, the myth she had so carefully constructed. No one had dared to see the person, let alone name the sorrow she kept so deeply buried. She opened her mouth to offer a corporate, dismissive reply, but the words wouldn't come. Maya seemed to understand. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft. "My daddy has sad eyes sometimes, too. When he thinks about my mommy." She paused, then added with absolute certainty. "But he has happy music inside him. It helps." She pushed her folder across the vast expanse of the desk. "This is for you." Eleanor pulled the folder closer, her movements stiff. She opened it. Inside was a single drawing, rendered in bold, waxy crayon. It depicted 3 stick figures under a giant, smiling yellow sun. On the left was a tall man. In the middle, a little girl with a bright pink dress. And on the right, a woman, taller than the man, with a lopsided, yellow triangle on her head, a crown. All 3 of them were holding hands. In the corner, Maya had carefully printed her name. M.Y. Eleanor stared at the drawing. A child's fantasy. A janitor, his daughter, and a queen. It was absurd. It was profound. She ran a finger over the waxy texture of the sun, the paper still warm from Maya's hands. A gift. Not an investment, not a transaction. A simple, profound offering, given freely. For the first time since she was a child herself, she felt seen. Not as Ms. Vance, the titan of industry, but as the lonely woman with the sad eyes and the crayon crown. She held the drawing as if it were a priceless stock certificate, a document proving a value she had forgotten she possessed. She looked at Maya, and for the first time, a genuine, uncalculated smile touched her lips. The bridge between their worlds had been built, and it was made of paper and crayons. The drawing sat propped against the monitor on her desk, a defiant splash of color in her monochrome world. It was a constant, silent question. It drove her from the sterile comfort of her office and out into the living world. She found Marcus during his lunch break, not in the corporate cafeteria, but in a small, manicured park a block away from the tower. He was sitting on a bench under a maple tree, eating a sandwich from a brown paper bag, watching the city rush by as if he were on the quiet banks of a river. She sat on the other end of the bench. For a long moment they didn't speak, the silence between them filled with the city's ambient hum. The piano music, his hidden confession, echoed in her mind. "The music you played," she began, her voice quiet, a probe into the heart of the mystery. "The other night. During the storm. Who was it for?" Marcus stopped chewing. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He could have denied it, feigned ignorance. But in her eyes, he saw not the powerful CEO, but the woman who had cried in the shadows. He saw the woman who had smiled at his daughter's drawing. He lowered his sandwich and looked out at the street. "Her name was Sarah," he said, the words coming out softly, freighted with the weight of years. It was a confession. "She was my wife. She played the cello. I played the piano. That was our language." He traced an invisible line on the bench with his finger. "There was a scholarship. Juilliard. A career. We had a plan." He took a deep breath, the air catching in his throat. "Then one night, a drunk driver had a different plan. After she was gone, there was just Maya. And the music was too loud. It was full of everything. I had to put it away. To be a father. You can't raise a child and chase a ghost at the same time. I had to choose." He looked at his own hands, the hands that could coax masterpieces from ivory and now scrubbed floors. He had made his choice without regret, but not without a quiet, lingering grief for the man he might have been. The raw, unadorned honesty of his story settled over Eleanor. He had given up his dream not in failure, but as an act of supreme love. It was a concept so foreign to her own experience, it felt like a revelation. His vulnerability was not a weakness, it was the bedrock of his strength. And in that moment it gave her the courage to offer her own. "My father built an empire in shipping," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He never taught me a language of love. He taught me the language of ledgers. Affection was a reward for achievement. Pride was contingent on profit margins." She stared at her own manicured hands, which had signed billion-dollar deals but had never been held with simple, unconditional warmth. "The day I took this company public, making us both obscenely wealthy, he called me. I waited for him to say he was proud. He just said, the Q3 numbers are acceptable. Don't get complacent." A single, bitter tear escaped, and she wiped it away with an angry motion. "He taught me that needing someone was a liability. That love was just the word people used for a transaction they were ashamed of." She finally looked at him, her own confession hanging in the air between them. "I built a fortress of glass and steel so no one could ever get close enough to see that I don't know how to do anything else." They were no longer the CEO and the consultant. They were just two people on a park bench, sharing the stories of their core wounds. The space between them was no longer an empty gulf, but a sacred ground of shared understanding. Marcus shifted slightly closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The touch was not possessive, not romantic. It was grounding. A simple, physical acknowledgement, "I hear you. I see you." Through the fine fabric of her dress, his warmth was an anchor in the storm of her life. And for the first time, she did not pull away. Chadwick Jennings watched the unfolding narrative between Eleanor and the janitor with a growing sense of alarm. He saw them in the park. He saw the drawing on her desk. He saw the way she looked at Marcus when she thought no one was looking. This wasn't a pet project anymore, it was a contamination. Her focus was drifting from the cold, hard metrics of success to this sentimental distraction. It was a weakness, and Chadwick had built his career on exploiting the weaknesses of others. If she was going to be compromised by a man who pushed a broom, she was unfit to lead. And he was more than ready to take her place. He hired a private investigator, a discreet man who specialized in digging up the kind of dirt that could ruin lives. It didn't take long. Marcus Thorne's life was simple, almost monastic, but no life is without its fractures. The investigator found a hospital report from 2 years prior. Maya had fallen from a playground climbing structure and broken her arm. The babysitter at the time, an elderly woman from their apartment building, had dozed off. It was a simple, unfortunate accident, and the subsequent hospital review had found no signs of negligence or abuse. But in Chadwick's hands, the story could be twisted. A single father. A demanding, low-wage job. A child's injury. It was a perfect, ugly triangle. He typed out the anonymous tip himself, using a burner phone and a public Wi-Fi network. He painted a picture of neglect, of a father stretched too thin, of a child left in unsafe conditions. He knew exactly which bureaucratic buttons to push. He sent it to the city's Child Protective Services division and sat back to watch the poison do its work. 2 days later, a woman with a tired face and a thick binder knocked on the door of Marcus's small, second-floor apartment. The space was humble but meticulously kept, filled with the warm clutter of a loving home. Maya's drawings were taped to the refrigerator. A stack of library books sat on the coffee table. The air smelled of cinnamon and laundry soap. But the CPS agent saw none of that. She saw a single-parent household flagged for potential neglect. The questions were invasive, humiliating. She inspected the food in his cupboards, the state of Maya's bedroom, the locks on the windows. She asked Marcus about his work hours, his childcare arrangements, his history. Every question was a veiled accusation. Marcus, the man who had sacrificed everything to be a good father, now had the one pure thing in his life held up to a cold, institutional light, scrutinized for flaws. It was a terrifying, soul-crushing violation. He felt the foundations of his world begin to crack. Word traveled fast in the corporate world, especially when lubricated by Chadwick's strategic whispers. The anonymous CPS investigation into Eleanor Vance's special consultant became the topic of hushed conversations in the hallways. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting. The optics, they argued, were a nightmare. A PR disaster in the making, one of them said, his face grim. A janitor, a CPS probe, it reflects on your judgment, Eleanor. On the company's stability. You must distance yourself. Immediately. The choice was laid bare before her, sharp and clear as a shard of glass. Protect her old world, the company's sterile image, the board's approval, the fortress she had built. Or protect her new one, the quiet man who spoke music and the little girl who drew crowns. Eleanor walked into the emergency board meeting, the air thick with tension and quiet disapproval. She let them all have their say, listening to their talk of brand integrity, shareholder confidence, and damage control. They spoke of Marcus as a liability, a problem to be managed and discarded. When they were finished, she stood up, her posture radiating a calm, unshakable authority that had nothing to do with her title. For the past 10 years, she began, her voice low and steady, silencing the room. Our greatest asset has been our brand. Today, that changes. From now on, our greatest asset will be our integrity. She looked from one anxious face to the next. And Marcus Thorne has more integrity in his little finger than this entire room combined. Her gaze fell on Chadwick, who looked away, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. He is not a liability. He is a victim of a cruel, baseless attack. And this company, my company, does not abandon its people. We protect them. Before they could argue, she acted. She left the boardroom and called the senior partner at the most powerful family law firm in the city, a man who owed her a significant favor. I am sending a man to you, David, she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. His name is Marcus Thorne. You will give him your best people. You will destroy this case. The bill comes to me. Then, she did something she had never done. She left the tower in the middle of the workday. She took a taxi to Marcus's apartment building, a world of brick and fire escapes away from her own. She climbed the 2 flights of stairs and knocked on his door. He opened it, and she saw a man utterly undone. The quiet stillness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, hunted fear. He looked smaller, overwhelmed by the weight of the accusation against him. The apartment, usually so warm, felt cold with dread. I'm scared, he confessed, the words a ragged whisper. The two most powerful words he could have spoken. They were not a plea for help, but a statement of shared humanity. Eleanor stepped inside into his world. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. You're not alone in this, she said. It was not a platitude, it was a promise. A declaration of allegiance. Maya came out of her room, her face pale, and ran to her father's side. Eleanor knelt, not as a CEO, but as a friend. She was now inside their fortress, not as an intruder, but as a reinforcing wall. In that small, cluttered living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived with love, she made her choice. She had chosen them. She had chosen their warm, messy, complicated world over her own cold, perfect one. They were an alliance. And they would face the storm together. The annual Vance Innovations Foundation Gala was the glittering centerpiece of the city's social calendar, a high-stakes affair where fortunes were donated and reputations were made or broken. This year, an undercurrent of ugly gossip ran beneath the polite chatter and clinking champagne glasses. The story of Eleanor's charity case and the CPS investigation was the evening's most sought-after currency. Chadwick Jennings moved through the crowd like a shark, smug and confident, accepting sympathetic murmurs about Eleanor's questionable judgment. Marcus stood beside Eleanor near the grand ballroom's entrance, looking out of place and uncomfortable in a rented tuxedo. He was her guest of honor, a public declaration of her support that defied her board and shocked the city's elite. He felt the weight of their stares, the sting of their whispered judgments. The investigation was still open, a dark cloud hanging over him, and his presence here felt like a reckless gamble. A sudden commotion rippled through the hall. The gala's main entertainment, a world-renowned concert pianist, had been in a minor car accident and would be unable to perform. A wave of disappointment washed over the guests. Chadwick saw his opportunity. With several major donors and board members within earshot, he strode over to Marcus and Eleanor, a cruel, mocking smile on his face. "Well, what a shame," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "But maybe there's a solution." He turned his venomous smile on Marcus. "Hey, Thorne. I hear you dabble. Here's your big chance to earn your keep. Why don't you fill in?" It was a public execution. A deliberate, vicious attempt to humiliate Marcus, to expose him as the janitor playing dress-up, to prove to everyone that he was nothing more than a fraud Eleanor had foolishly championed. The ballroom fell into a shocked, expectant silence. 1,000 pairs of eyes turned to Marcus. He was trapped, cornered in a spotlight of malice. He looked at Eleanor. Her face was pale with fury at Chadwick's cruelty, but when her eyes met his, there was no pressure. There was no fear. There was only a deep, abiding, and absolute trust. She saw him, the real him. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Show them who you are." Something inside Marcus shifted. The fear, the shame, the weight of the past weeks, it all fell away, replaced by a cold, quiet fire. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the stage. He moved with a purpose that silenced the whispers. He sat at the magnificent grand piano, the instrument gleaming under the stage lights. He didn't look at the crowd. He closed his eyes, took a single, deep breath, and placed his hands on the keys. He began to play. It was the music from the storm. The melody of his soul. But it was different this time. It wasn't just a private confession of grief. It was a testament. He played the memory of Sarah's laughter. He played the fierce, protective love for his daughter. He played the quiet dignity of his work, the lonely nights, the unwavering sacrifice. And then, the music changed. A new theme wove its way in, a theme of unexpected connection, of a light in the darkness, of a woman with sad eyes who saw him. The music swelled, no longer just a lament, but a declaration of strength, of grief transformed into resilience, of love not as a memory, but as a living, breathing force. The entire room was held captive. The sound was so pure, so honest, it stripped away all the artifice of the evening. It was not a performance. It was a revelation. It laid bare the petty cruelty of Chadwick's gesture, exposing it as small and hollow in the face of such profound beauty. The music was Marcus's truth, and it was undeniable. When the final, hopeful chord faded into the breathless silence, no one moved. Then, a single person began to clap. And then another, and another, until the ballroom erupted in a thunderous, heartfelt ovation that was less about politeness and more about awe. People were on their feet, their faces etched with emotion. Some were openly weeping. Marcus sat at the piano, his head bowed, his own tears falling onto the keys. He had not only reclaimed his music, he had shared his soul, and they had understood. Eleanor walked onto the stage, her own eyes glistening. She took the microphone from its stand. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong, resonating with a new kind of power. "For too long," she said, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, "I have defined value by profit margins and market share. Tonight, Mr. Marcus Thorne has reminded us all what true value is." She turned and looked directly at him, her heart in her eyes. "It's courage. It's integrity. It is the quiet strength that holds a family together, and the private grief we carry with dignity." She took a step closer to him. "It is love." She reached out, and in front of 1,000 witnesses, she took his hand. She held it tightly, their fingers intertwining. The gesture was a public vow, a definitive statement. They were a unit. And their joint vindication was complete. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The public humiliation of Chadwick Jennings, followed by his spectacular failure to discredit Marcus, made him toxic. An internal investigation, personally overseen by Eleanor, unearthed a mountain of evidence: the burner phone records, the Wi-Fi logs, witness statements about his targeted harassment, all tracing the malicious CPS report directly back to him. He was fired the next morning, his dismissal a cold, one-line email. He was escorted from the building by security, a hollowed-out man who had gambled his ambition against a good man's soul and lost spectacularly. The CPS case, now revealed to be the product of a malicious, false report, was closed within the week, an official apology sent to Marcus's lawyer. The storm had passed. That night, Eleanor and Marcus found their way to the building's rooftop garden, a secret oasis of green she had commissioned years ago, but had rarely visited. The city glittered below them, a sprawling galaxy of silent, distant lights. The noise of the gala, of the accusations, of their entire tumultuous journey, faded away, leaving only the quiet hum of the wind and the thrumming of their own hearts. They stood side by side, not touching, letting the peace settle around them. The adrenaline of the evening receded, leaving behind a raw, fragile, and beautiful intimacy. "You saw me," Marcus said finally, his voice soft. It wasn't an accusation or a question. It was a statement of fact, of a miracle. When no one else did. Eleanor turned to him, the faint light from the cityscape catching the lingering emotion in her eyes. "You made me listen," she replied. "To something other than the noise." Words felt inadequate, clumsy. The space between them was charged with everything they had endured and everything they had become to one another. He had seen the lonely woman beneath the crown. She had seen the virtuoso behind the uniform. She took a small step closer, into his space. He didn't back away. He met her halfway, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The kiss, when it happened, was not a sudden spark, but the slow, inevitable meeting of two tides. It was gentle, tentative at first, a question asked and answered in the same breath. It was a kiss of gratitude, of relief, of a profound and soul-deep recognition. It was the resolution of the music, the quiet, final chord that promised a new beginning. She leaned into his embrace, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor Vance felt truly, completely safe. 1 year later. Sunlight, thick and golden as honey, streamed into the living room of a comfortable house on a tree-lined street. It wasn't a sterile penthouse or a cramped apartment. It was a home, filled with the warm, lived-in scent of coffee and wood polish. At an old, lovingly maintained upright piano, Marcus played a joyful, intricate melody that danced through the open windows. At the large kitchen table, Maya, now 7, was meticulously coloring a complex drawing of a dragon, her tongue stuck out in concentration. And by the window, tending to a row of flourishing potted herbs, was Eleanor. She wore jeans and a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back loosely, a genuine, easy smile on her face as she pinched off a basil leaf and inhaled its scent. It was a tableau of happy, domestic normalcy, a world away from the glass tower and the marble lobby where their lives had first collided. That afternoon, they stood together on a different kind of stage. It was the opening ceremony for the Sarah Thorne Music Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing free musical education and instruments to underprivileged children across the city. Funded by a substantial endowment from Vance Innovations and Eleanor's personal fortune, it was the perfect synthesis of their strengths, his soul and her power, his art and her resources. It was a living monument to the woman he had lost and a testament to the future they were building together, a shared purpose that healed their individual wounds by bringing hope to others. Later that evening, long after the guests had departed, Marcus and Eleanor stood in their own small garden, the scent of roses and damp earth hanging in the cool night air. The sky was clear, dotted with a million distant stars. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his warmth, her head resting on his shoulder. "Sarah would have loved this," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have loved what you've done. She would have loved you." Eleanor closed her eyes, a feeling of profound peace settling deep in her bones. She placed her hands over his. "We built this," she whispered, "not just of the foundation, but of the life they now shared. Not a company. A home." Their shared purpose was a melody, and for the first time in their lives, they were both playing in key. Where are you watching from? From a bustling city or a quiet town? If this story of love, healing, and second chances touched your heart, please like and subscribe. Your support allows us to tell more stories like this. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and never stop listening to the music inside you.